Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. A few weeks ago, I released a video in which I gave my preliminary projections for how well the upcoming MCU movie Deadpool and Wolverine might do at the box office. The movie, which opens this weekend and is the only MCU movie that's going to be released this year, follows the release of the worst performing MCU movie of all time, 2023's The Marvels. But the revised projections for Deadpool and Wolverine are actually looking better than before. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please share the video on social media, please subscribe to support this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! A few movies are performing quite well so far this year, such as Disney Pixar's animated movie Inside Out 2, which just surpassed the earnings of last year's highest grossing movie, Barbie, as of this past weekend that ended on July 21st, when it reached $1,443.3 million. And the current second highest grossing movie so far this year, Dune Part 2, is about to be surpassed very soon by another animated movie, Illumination Entertainment's animated sequel, Despicable Me 4, whose earnings reached $574.4 million as of this weekend, which placed the movie into third place overall by surpassing the global and domestic earnings of Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. But there have also been some real lemons this year that have been massive box office flops, such as Warner Brothers' prequel spin-off Furiosa: A Mad Max Saga, Universal Pictures' action comedy drama The Fall Guy, Paramount Pictures' animated/live-action fantasy comedy entitled If, and Sony and Columbia Pictures' woke female disaster of a superhero movie entitled Madam Web. And this past weekend, another flop opened in theaters in spite of it opening as the #1 movie at the domestic box office. The sequel, Twisters, which was co-produced by Universal Pictures, Warner Brothers, and Amblin Entertainment. And all of these flops share one thing in common. The studio spent far too much money to produce each of them as compared with the amount of interest that the general public had to pay to see them. Now for Deadpool and Wolverine, when it opens this weekend, it will actually have the highest production budget for any movie so far this year, as far as I can recall, at a whopping $250 million. And when we multiply that production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. But last year's blockbuster movies that had similar production budgets, such as Disney and Lucasfilm's Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction, Warner Brothers and DC Studios' The Flash, and Disney and Marvel Studios' The Marvels, all flopped and lost hundreds of millions of dollars for their respective studios. In fact, those were last year's three biggest flops. But Deadpool and Wolverine has two things going for it that none of those other movies had. Two very popular characters and the rivalry that exists between them. Deadpool, aka Wade Wilson, as played by Ryan Reynolds, and Wolverine, aka Logan, as played by Hugh Jackman. Each of the previous two Deadpool movies that were released in 2016 and 2018 did very well at the box office, and the last time that Hugh Jackman portrayed Wolverine in 2017's movie Logan, it did quite well at the box office also. And that's what separates this movie from everything else that has preceded it this year, as well as the numerous blockbuster flops of 2023. Plus, countless fans of each of these characters have been wanting to see a movie featuring the two of them together for many years. So yes, this is a fan service movie, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If Hollywood spent more time producing content that fans actually want to see instead of the ideological crap that they want to push onto everyone, there wouldn't be as many box office flops or streaming failures occurring. So when I released my original set of projections for Deadpool and Wolverine 3 weeks ago, they were based on predictions for the movie's opening weekend domestic box office from Box Office Pro that were between $175 million to $200 million. But Box Office Pro has since revised their predicted domestic opening weekend box office revenue for the movie to a range from $180 million to $220 million, which is a sizable increase because the midpoint for their original predicted range was $187.5 million, but the revised predicted range's midpoint has gone up to $200 million. And that's an increase of $12.5 million. And while that may not sound like a huge increase, over the course of the movie's entire theatrical run, that could result in much larger final domestic and global gross box office earnings. But we also have to ask how reasonable that predicted domestic opening weekend box office range is. So we'll compare it against the historic overall franchise average domestic opening weekend box office for all 33 previous MCU movies, which is $132.6 million, and the standard deviation is $69.3 million. So one standard deviation above the franchise average domestic opening weekend box office is around $202 million. The $200 million midpoint for the updated predicted range is just below that, but the range itself does extend slightly above it, which in this case I think is entirely reasonable given that the movie stars two very popular actors, Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman, as two very iconic characters. So as I did 3 weeks ago, I'm going to base my projections for Deadpool and Wolverine on statistical data derived from the preceding 33 MCU movies, since Deadpool and Wolverine is an MCU movie. To project what the movie's final domestic box office earnings might be, I'll use a range of average weekly drops that are statistically derived from the previous 33 MCU movies, whose overall franchise average weekly drop is 38.19%, with a standard deviation of 6.45%. And one standard deviation above and below the MCU's franchise average weekly drop gives me a range of 31.74% to 44.65%. And given how wide that range is for the possible average weekly drops, rather than use the full range of predicted opening weekend box office from $180 million to $220 million, I'll only use its mid-range value of $200 million to keep the projections from diverging too much. And when I do that, I can project that the final domestic box office for Deadpool and Wolverine might be on the order of $448 million at the low end, $523.6 million at the mid-range, and $629.4 million at the upper end, which is a higher range than what I projected 3 weeks ago. And that would be an incredible final domestic box office for the movie since the mid-range value is 0.88 standard deviations above the franchise's average final domestic box office value of $355.7 million. Now, to project what the movie's final global gross box office earnings might be, I'll initially only use the MCU's overall average domestic share of 41.41%. And when I do that, I can project that the movie's final global gross box office revenue might range from $1,082 million at the low end, $1,264 million at the mid-range, and $1,520 million at the upper end, which again strongly suggests that the movie has a very high probability of breaking $1 billion at the global box office. But since we don't yet know what the movie's final domestic share is going to be, I'll also use a range of possible domestic shares that are plus or minus one standard deviation from the franchise average, which gives us a range from 34.42% to 48.41%. And using that range, it extends the previous range that I listed from a low of $925.4 million to a high of $1,829 million. So even from that extended range, if the movie's final global gross box office earnings end up being closer to $925.4 million, that's still well above the movie's estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. So I believe that we can safely say from everything that we currently know that Deadpool and Wolverine has a very high probability of breaking even. It's also possible that Deadpool and Wolverine could become the second highest grossing movie both domestically and worldwide for 2024 because while its projections are very good, following the most statistically likely projections for it could place it somewhere between where the current earnings for Inside Out 2 are now, as well as the projected final global gross earnings for that movie and those for Despicable Me 4, as I had talked about in a video that I had released on July 22nd. But naturally, we'll have to wait and see. And this is in stark contrast to the box office earnings of the most recently released MCU movie, 2023's The Marvels, which ended up having the lowest domestic opening weekend box office, the lowest final domestic box office earnings, and the lowest final global gross box office earnings for the entire MCU, while it had a massive reported production budget of around $274.8 million. So based on the current predicted domestic opening weekend box office for Deadpool and Wolverine, and the projections that I made that are based on the performance of the past 33 MCU movies, I am very confident that Deadpool and Wolverine will have no difficulty breaking even. And I also believe that it has a very good chance that it could break $1 billion at the worldwide box office. People like Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman, as well as their iconic characters of Deadpool and Wolverine, but I don't see this movie as being an overall turnaround for the MCU. Instead, it's probably just going to be a very positive one-off because none of the other upcoming MCU movies that won't start to premiere until at least 2025 are likely going to be anywhere near as good. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.